Peter Sutcliffe is one of the most infamous killers in British history. For 5 years he evaded capture while brutally murdering 13 young women across the north of England. It was an investigation with twists and turns and a case that still haunts the British public to this day.
For years, women and girls felt that simply leaving their homes at night meant taking their lives in their hands.
When Sutcliffe was eventually apprehended on January the 2nd, 1981, it brought an end to a manhunt that had both terrified and captivated the nation. The press had dubbed him the Yorkshire Ripper.
For women, it was a very frightening time, and they were stuck in this awful position of being told they shouldn't go out at night. It had an enormous social effect on the country.
As well as his 13 victims, Sutcliffe had attacked at least 7 more women. His arrest was a huge relief for the under-pressure detectives at West Yorkshire Police.
He attacked at random. We couldn't anticipate his moves. The whole of the north of England was held in a grip of terror, really, by this man. There was a sort of, I can only describe it as a Gothic-type cloud over the area.
But the Yorkshire Ripper's story begins over 70 years ago. Peter Sutcliffe was born on the 2nd of June 1946 in the market town of Bingley on the outskirts of Bradford, West Yorkshire.
He was the youngest of quite a large family. His brothers and sisters were all of strong character. They were all working class, could look after themselves. But Peter was a shy boy and very much attached to his mother.
His mother was somebody who was very much dominated and controlled by his father. So I think he had quite a lot of sympathy for his mum, and he thought the world of her as a child. But Peter was somebody who was quite shy, quite awkward, he was quite skinny and scrawny. And I don't think he ever lived up to his father's expectations. And I think that planted that seed of shame in Peter Sutcliffe that would come to shape the rest of his life.
Sutcliffe's awkward demeanour as a child manifested into a dysfunctional adulthood, demonstrated in his early career choices.
Peter Sutcliffe had a variety of different jobs throughout his life. He worked as a gravedigger for quite a period of time, and it was reported that he stole things from the corpses that he was burying. Now that suggests to me that he wasn't horrified or repulsed by dead bodies, and that's something that would be quite influential later on.
On Valentine's Day 1967, 21-year-old Sutcliffe met Sonia Shermer. The pair began a long-term relationship, eventually getting married in August 1974.
The relationship that he had with his wife, Sonia, appeared to have been a decent one, and I think he would have treated her fairly well because she served a purpose for him. Women like his mother and his wife, he saw as carers and nurturers, people who would look after him. Other women, I think he saw somewhat differently. I think Peter Sutcliffe's view of women is very black and white. They are either Madonnas or they are whores. So they're either these perfect domestic angels or they're these sinful creatures.
These opposing views on women collided with one another when a family revelation dramatically altered 23-year-old Sutcliffe's world. His mother, whom he'd looked up to as a child, had been unfaithful.
His mother had had an affair with a policeman, and his father had decided to confront his wife at a hotel where she was meeting this particular man, and took Peter with him.
Peter's father basically humiliated her and said, look, I know all about what's going on, and the children found out as well. So I think this kind of further cemented ideas as to what women were, what could be expected of them, always to be cautious and wary of them.
I think there was every possibility that after seeing his mother and seeing what happened, that possibly preyed on his mind and affected his attitude towards women.
Sutcliffe began to visit the red light districts of Yorkshire and find solace in prostitutes. But his feelings for these women would soon lead to violence and eventually murder. On the morning of October the 30th, 1975, just 12 miles away in the Chapeltown area of Leeds, the body of 28-year-old Wilma McCann was discovered in a local park.
Wilma McCann was a Scottish woman who had come down to Yorkshire. She was working as a prostitute. She was very hard up, and it was very difficult for her because she had young children, young family to support. And I think that was the only way she felt she could get enough money.
The attack on Wilma McCann set in motion what would become a clear pattern and regular method of ambush by the killer.
His modus operandi was to use a ball-peen hammer and was to strike them very hard and very fast on the back of the head so they fell unconscious. He used his hammer and hit her over the back of the head, and then he stabbed her 15 times in the neck, chest and abdomen.
But the police were no closer to catching the killer, and 3 months later, on the 20th of January 1976, another woman was murdered in Leeds. 42-year-old wife and mother Emily Jackson, who'd vanished after a night out at her local pub. Emily's son Neil was 17 years old at the time. He remembers receiving the tragic news on that fateful morning.
I've come downstairs. My dad's loading one of the vans up for work, and I'm getting my boots on ready for going to work and having a pot of tea, when they were knocking at the door and it opened the place. And that's when I first knew. And it was first knew when, like I said, for Dad, when the police knocked at the door. I can still remember it plain as day.
Again, a hammer had been used in the brutal attack. Emily had also been stabbed a total of 52 times with a screwdriver. Like Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson had been working as a prostitute to make ends meet.
It was just to help the family in dire straits, is what I've been told afterwards. When family were in hard times work-wise, she went elsewhere, but I didn't realise till well after.
This time, police were able to recover from the scene a key piece of evidence. On Emily's right thigh was a very firm and visible footprint from a size 7 Wellington boot.
For some inexplicable reason, he stamped on her thigh with such force that it left an imprint of the sole of his boot on her thigh. Now, police tried to trace that boot, or the manufacturers of the boot, which they did, and then try and find out people who had bought them, but it didn't come to anything.
Once again, the trail went cold. It was over a year until a murder with a familiar MO took place in Leeds. On the morning of February the 5th, 1977, the body of 28-year-old Irene Richardson was discovered. She'd been savagely murdered, another prostitute killed with a hammer. West Yorkshire police were suddenly dealing with a serial killer. What they didn't realise is that this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most infamous series of murders in British history. Less than 3 months after the death of a third victim, Irene Richardson, the killer struck again. On the night of the 23rd of April 1977, 32-year-old prostitute Patricia Atkinson became victim number 4. She was murdered in her own flat, this time not in Leeds, but in nearby Bradford.
She believed that if she invited customers into her flat, she was safe because all the killings had taken place in isolated parks or back alleys. So she thought she was safe, but she wasn't.
The killer hit Patricia 4 times around the head with a hammer and then mutilated her body with a knife. This time, detectives found a clue to link the murders of Patricia Atkinson and Emily Jackson.
The police found the same boot mark on the bedclothes at Patricia's house, Patricia's flat, as they found on Emily Jackson's thigh.
This crucial link confirmed the authorities' worst fears. The killer was expanding his hunting ground, and he seemed to have a favoured target. All 4 murder victims had been working as prostitutes. On the 17th of November 1980 in Leeds, Jacqueline Hill, a 20-year-old student, was hit over the head, stabbed repeatedly and mutilated. An attack that bore all the hallmarks of the Ripper. But Jacqueline Hill would be Peter Sutcliffe's final victim. Within 2 months, a routine police stop would lead to one of the most sensational arrests of modern times. The capture of the Yorkshire Ripper.
Just after New Year, on January 2nd, 1981, Peter went to Sheffield and picked up a prostitute. On the same evening, a policeman with a lot of years of service, decided to show a young rookie round Sheffield.
The two police officers spotted Sutcliffe's car near offices on Melbourne Avenue in Sheffield's red light district. They decided to approach and talk to the pair.
The cops asked, what's your girlfriend's name? He said, I don't know, we've only just met. And the policeman said, you know, I haven't just fallen off a Christmas tree. So he already realised there was something odd going on.
Peter said that he needed to urinate, and the officers let him go up to a wall by the side of the building. While he was away, the young police officer did a PNC check on the registration of the car and found that the plates were false. So Peter was arrested and taken to Dewsbury police station.
Once down at the station, Sutcliffe was searched. He wasn't carrying any weapons, but this time detectives weren't going to let him slip from their grasp.
So one of them thought, let's go back to that place where we spotted him and let's see if he did leave anything when he popped out of the car saying he was going to have a pee.
The police returned to the scene of the original arrest.
They found the hammer, the intended murder weapon, and they came back with them. And gradually after that, Peter Sutcliffe realised that the game was up, and eventually he confessed. And his only condition was that he be allowed to tell his wife, Sonia, before it became known to the general public that he was indeed the Yorkshire Ripper.
It had been over 5 years since the murder of Wilma McCann, but detectives finally had the Ripper in custody. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on the 17th of March 1942. The second of 3 children, Gacy had a difficult upbringing. His father was an alcoholic who was reportedly both mentally and physically abusive to his children and their mother.
His father spent apparently all of Gacy's childhood demeaning him and physically punishing him and telling him how stupid and worthless and effeminate he was.
Gacy's childhood friend Barry Boschelli remembers the physical abuse he suffered at the hands of his father.
If Johnny was 2 minutes late, no food. So a lot of times Johnny ate at our house and stayed at our house overnight. He used to take Johnny when he was sitting at the kitchen table, and he would take his fist and hit Johnny in the face.
The father is a very significant figure in the genesis of Gacy's terrible deeds. For, to my mind, Gacy was always trying to satisfy his father, whom he never could. He was beaten repeatedly by his father, with belts, with brooms. At one stage, he was knocked out by him.
These people grow up with such a malignant view of the world and of human relationships, and feeling that human relationships are not based on love and trust and respect, you know, that they're all based on exploitation and cruelty and inflicting pain.
Gacy was a sickly child. He suffered from a heart condition, limiting his involvement in sports activities and consequently alienating him from his peers. Aged 11, an accident in a playground led to his teenage years being blighted by blackouts and hospital visits.
At that time, the swings were wooden base swings with heavy chains coming down. Johnny went to grab it, and the swing clipped him right across the forehead and knocked him to the ground.
By 1966, 24-year-old Gacy was married and had relocated to the city of Waterloo, 300 miles west of Chicago, in the neighboring state of Iowa.
Well, Gacy got married and life from the outside appeared to be relatively normal. He had quite a good job. His wife had 2 children. So they appeared to be the typical cereal box American nuclear family. And Gacy wasn't just a regular family man. He was also quite active in the local Chamber of Commerce, and he played quite an active role. And he was a real figure in the local community.
Gacy had started to build the perfect life for himself, but he was concealing a dark secret. He developed an unhealthy sexual interest in young boys.
There was a son of a fellow JC member who he lured back to his home and he sexually assaulted. So he's abusing power. He's getting into these positions of trust and he's taking advantage, and that's a theme that's going to continue for him.
And then when the kid revealed this to his father and Gacy was arrested for it, Gacy hired another teenager to intimidate this kid, to lure this kid into some remote place and spray mace in his eyes and beat him up and warned him against testifying in Gacy's case.
Despite Gacy's efforts, his victim still testified, but there wasn't conclusive proof of an attack. Therefore, police were only able to charge him with sodomy of the 15-year-old boy.
He pleaded guilty to one count of sodomy, thinking he would get a very, very minimal sentence. But the judge threw the book at him, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
On the 3rd of December 1968, Gacy was sent to Anamosa State Penitentiary.
Gacy actually handcuffs himself and turns around and struggles with the handcuffs, and then turns back and he holds the handcuffs up. And Peast is pretty amazed at that, and he said, well, that's neat, how'd you do that? So Gacy says, well, here, you handcuff yourself, and I'll show you how to do that. So Peast handcuffs himself, and he struggles, and he struggles, and he struggles. And he looks at Gacy and he says, now, what's the trick to this? And Gacy reaches in his pocket and pulls out a key to the handcuffs, and he says, the trick is, you gotta have this key.
This handcuff trick was part of an horrific yet clinical MO.
Gacy, throughout all of the 33 killings, had developed a method of killing these young kids.
He would pick up these victims. Some were kids who worked for him, but most were teenage runaways, and bring them back to his house and giving them drinks. He would sort of trick them into handcuffing themselves or being handcuffed.
Gacy would use chloroform to subdue his victims. Chloroform's an old-fashioned anaesthetic, really, so it gets into your lungs and it just renders you unconscious very effectively.
He did what he called the rope trick. And when he had these young kids incapacitated like that, he would slip a rope over their neck, a knotted rope like a loop, and then put the stick in the back like a tourniquet, and he would slowly turn the tourniquet. And he said he had it perfected so well that he knew exactly how the body would react to each half turn.
Putting a ligature around the neck, the first thing it's going to block is the blood vessels, so it prevents blood getting to the brain, prevents it getting back to the body from the brain. It's going to be very uncomfortable, and it can even render you unconscious in a small number of seconds.
And he went into detail on how he would torture these young men. And he, in fact, did double and triple murders. He would incapacitate 2 or 3 people at a time and kill one person in front of the other victims, and then continue to kill the other victims. And he seemed to be pretty proud of that. We used that to our advantage to keep him talking, and he described every killing to a T, exactly how it happened, all 33.
As the news broke across the country, one shocked viewer who'd unknowingly experienced Gacy's MO firsthand was his ex-employee, Tony Antonucci. Whilst working for PDM, Tony had accidentally got a nail stuck in his foot.
John took me and I got a tetanus shot and took me home. And he came over later that evening to check on if I was okay, or that was the theory, but he also had, some wine, and we were drinking, and he was kind of joking around. It was probably 10:30 at night. I was a high school wrestler, and he said, oh, you're a big wrestler guy, and he started wrestling around with me. He got my left arm, and he got it behind me, and I felt him put a handcuff on it. I kept flailing my right hand around so that he couldn't get my right arm, but eventually he did get a hold of my right arm, and he knocked me down to the floor with my hands behind me. He left the room for a few minutes, and I realized that if I pulled really hard on my right hand, that I could pull my hand through the handcuff. I could get it out.
By pretending he was still handcuffed, Tony was able to catch Gacy unawares when he returned and turn the situation to his advantage.
I took the handcuff that I had gotten out of and I handcuffed him on one of his wrists, and I reached into his pocket, got the key, and I handcuffed him behind his back, laying face down. He goes, "You're the only one that not only got out of the handcuffs, you got them on me." And I didn't know what that meant. I thought that this was some type of test that he had performed before. And I let him stay handcuffed for 10 or 15 minutes before I let him out of the handcuffs, and he had previously agreed that when I let him up, he would leave, and he did.
Tony had no idea just how close he'd come to being another victim of this deadly killer. On the 21st of December 1978, they searched Gacy's home on West Somerdale Avenue for the second time.
When they executed that search warrant, they went in the crawl space, and the very first shovel that they dug, they found human remains.
Police had finally unearthed the secrets that Gacy had thought would stay buried forever.
So they immediately called me, let me know that there was human remains in a crawl space, and at that time I arrested John Gacy for murder. Gacy says he wants to confess, but really he wants to confess to the surveillance team, both myself and my partner and the other team. And now all of a sudden he's got an audience again, and he's on top of the world, and he knows he can't get out of it at this point, and so he might as well just divulge everything that actually happened.
Gacy told detectives he was willing to draw a map of the burial site beneath his home.
I gave him a pen, and he started right up. He squared it off in the thing, and he started, well, this was a double, and this was a triple, and this was the first guy put an X on it. Went around the whole crawl space with these places where the body was buried. I mean, they were digging with spoons and everything, but they obviously identified where all the bodies were, and they did an overlay of where the bodies were actually found compared to that diagram that he made, and it was unbelievable. It was right on the money.
In total, 27 bodies were discovered in Gacy's crawl space. It wouldn't take long for news of this horrific discovery to filter out to the wider world.
Then the arrest came down, and that was the headline on the local papers, everything, how many bodies they took out of Gacy's basement.
Well, when Gacy's crimes were uncovered, he entered into the record books, as America's most prolific serial murderer. The notion that this, pudgy, normal-seeming, decent, regular, ordinary guy was living in this horror house, that was just suffused with the stench of death, and that there were the rotting bodies of 27 young men in his crawl space, bringing home and torturing young boys right in the midst, of all his neighbors, and then going off to work the next day.
When we booked him for murder, we asked Gacy where he was born, and Gacy looked at us and said, "I was born in a state of confusion," and he smiled like that, and we captured the photo.
In total, Gacy confessed to the murder of 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978. His story begins over 50 years ago. Volker Eckert was born in the small East German town of Plauen on July 1st, 1959. From a very young age, he developed a fascination with women's hair.
When he was 9 years old, he started to be fond of the doll of his sister, a doll which had long hair, and he put them in front of him on his bed. He was feeling sexual arousal, plunging his hands into the hair of this doll.
We describe him as a trichophiliac. This is somebody who gains sexual pleasure from hair, essentially. And I think he would have been aware of the fact that this was something odd, this was something out of the ordinary. And I think that would have created a bit of a sense of shame within him. So he was aware that this was something that he had to keep hidden.
As Eckert entered adolescence, his parents' marriage began to break down.
Well, he had quite a turbulent time during his teenage years. His parents divorced and he reacted really badly to this.
The separation for him was influential because the father had to leave the house and he said, I swore to myself, that will never happen to me and I will not marry because I don't want to work all the time and then be thrown out of the house. And he took sides with his father after that. But he continued to live with his mother.
He went off the rails, and one incident involved taking his parents' car and going off on a bit of a joyride. And then he returned home and he was in a lot of trouble for that. And it wasn't too long after that incident that he actually went and physically attacked and killed one of his classmates.
In 1974, aged just 14, Eckert experienced taking a life for the very first time. But it wasn't until his arrest in November 2006, over 3 decades later, that anyone knew about it.
Volker Eckert confessed to killing a classmate and to disguising her murder as a suicide. And that crime was not solved for years, or for almost 32 years.
On May the 7th, 1974, Eckert had knocked on the door of his 14-year-old school friend and neighbour, Sylvia Unterdörfel. Realising her parents weren't home, he took the opportunity of living out the fantasy he'd dreamed of since playing with his sister's doll as a child.
And then he thought, well, I have to do it with a real girl. And he, of course, like many fetishists, they realize they won't do it voluntarily with me. So I have to force them.
She was somebody who had very long, very beautiful hair, and he developed a real fixation, a real obsession with her hair. And he went to where she lived, her home, and basically wormed his way in.
First, this girl only played a role in his fantasy as a victim. But the point came when this fantasy wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to do it. He wanted to stroke her and then kill her.
Und dann auch töten.
He started right away after she let him in, closed the door, and he started getting at her throat. And started to strangle her. And when she was unconscious, he plunged his hands into her hair.
Even as a teenager, Eckert had the sophistication to try and disguise the murder.
He strangled her with a clothesline, but he was quite cunning because he thought he needs to cover this up. So what he did is attach the end of the clothesline to a door handle to make it look as if she'd killed herself.
It is physically possible to hang yourself from a doorknob. You don't have to have your full body weight on the neck. And it's something that is occasionally seen, although it's uncommon.
Ihre Mutter, als sie dann von der Arbeit kam, hat die... Just as her mother was getting home from work, she walked in to find her dead daughter. Of course, like with every unnatural death, the East German investigation authorities began their work and came to the conclusion that it was a suicide. Es war ein Selbstmord.
At the end, Eckert managed to set up the scene so cleverly that the police fell into his trap.
And for 32 years, right up until Volker Eckert's confession, her parents had lived with the belief that their daughter had taken her own life.
When 47-year-old truck driver Volker Eckert was apprehended on the 17th of November 2006, the police had no idea of the extent of his history of murder. Eckert had been on the run for 2 weeks after killing a Bulgarian prostitute in the north of Spain. When detectives searched the cab of his articulated lorry, they found photographs and hair clippings from 5 women whom he'd abducted and murdered across Europe. Eckert's defense lawyer was Alexander Schmidtgall.
He confessed immediately after he got arrested by the police. You have this quite often when you have serial killers or when you have people who have a burden carried with them for a long time. It was like a relief for him to speak with someone and to tell what he did. Yeah? So it was like a confession in a church for him.
Schmidtgall couldn't believe the person he was talking to was the same cold-blooded killer he'd read about in the police files.
So you think there's a monster in front of you, but the actual communication with him, he was a very normal guy. He was like someone selling you life insurance. He was nothing special.
Prosecutors wanted to find out what was going on inside the head of Volker Eckert. He was sent off to be assessed by forensic psychologist Professor Norbert Nedopil.
He came from prison, guided by 2 policemen, into my offices, and then he sat with me for several hours alone, without policemen and without any handcuffs. And we had a long and serious conversation, sometimes sad, sometimes for him or frightening events, sometimes also were very nice and personal, and even sometimes we laughed together.
Eckert, who lived in the small town of Horf in Germany, had murdered his final victim on November the 2nd, 2006. Local journalist Rainer Meyer remembers the story well.
Volker Eckert hat seine letzte Tat.
Volker Eckert's last victim was the prostitute Milena Petrova near Ostelrich in Catalonia, North Spain.
Nordspanien, Katalonien. Dort hat die.
He picked her up there and abused her in his lorry. He spent another day driving around.
Herumgefahren in der Fahrerkabine. Und am nächsten Morgen.
And the morning after, he dumped her at a nearby stone bridge.
Steinbruch in der Nähe entsorgt.
On the way back from the stone bridge, he was caught on CCTV.
Einer Überwachungskamera.
Somebody was erecting CCTV cameras, which hadn't been there before, and just to test them, it panned. One of the images it caught was Eckert's lorry. And when the body that he dumped nearby was found, almost the first place the police went was to look at this entirely accidentally caught CCTV imagery, which led them directly to Eckert.
Eckert's job took him all over the continent. A Europe-wide search was conducted, and on November the 17th, 2006, detectives found him and his truck at a car wash in Cologne.
When they searched the lorry, they found evidence that this was not a one-off act. There were Polaroid photographs of other victims. There were trophies in the lorry. It was perfectly obvious that this was Eckert's lair. Almost every serial killer in one form or another has what's come to be known as a lair. And in his case, it wasn't so much a flat or a cottage or a house. It was the cab of his lorry.
After his arrest, Eckert immediately confessed to a murderous career that had lasted for over 30 years. It was the beginning of a huge international story.
Es waren 5 Morde, 3 in Spanien.
There were 5 murders, 3 in Spain, 2 in France. And from then on, it was a really hot story. As a journalist, you don't have a serial killer very often. And at that point, I tried to get as much information as I could about this person.
Über diesen Menschen herauszubekommen.
For local journalists in Horf, the trial of this perverse killer, due to take place in the local courthouse, was set to be a huge story.
Ja, jede Schlagzeile ist gut für eine Zeitung und jede spektakuläre.
Every headline is good for a newspaper, and every spectacular story is good for a newspaper. And it isn't the newspaper's fault that it interests people.
Alles, was nicht normal ist.
But everything that isn't normal stirs people. And if someone living in a community finds out that the nice uncle was not actually the nice uncle that everyone thought he was, but a perverse serial killer, then that stirs people too. And then they want to know as much as possible about it. And we are there for the purpose of delivering that information.
Menschen auch, und dann wollen die möglichst viel darüber wissen und diese Information zu liefern, dafür sind wir da.
While waiting for his trial in custody, Eckert had lost the support of his family.
I remember very well he was very desperate that he had completely lost the contact to his family, because his sister was always a very important point of contact for him through his whole life, and she didn't want to have contact with him.
Dann saß also in Bayreuth in dieser Justizvollzugsanstalt.
He was sitting inside his cell in the prison of Bayreuth and had a lot of time to think.
An seinem 48. Geburtstag.
On his 48th birthday, the 1st of July 2007, he knew that he would be officially charged with murder within the next few days.
Dass als Mörder angeklagt werden wird.
Nobody came to see him that day. His sister didn't visit, and neither did his brother.
Andere Familie, sein Bruder nicht.
It all became too much for him. On the night of his 48th birthday, July the 1st, 2007, Volker Eckert was left alone in his cell. The following morning, his body was found hanging from the bars. It was a case that spanned 2 decades. By the time Peter Tobin was found guilty of murdering teenage hitchhiker Dinah McNichol in 2009, he'd already been in prison for 2 years. He was serving life sentences for the murders of Angelika Kluk and 15-year-old schoolgirl Vicky Hamilton. The 63-year-old serial killer and rapist had buried all 3 girls across a 15-year period, 1 in Scotland and 2 on the south coast of England.
Another awful discovery at 50 Irvine Drive. A body bag thought to contain the remains of Dinah McNichol, brought out from what was the most ordinary of houses. It is no longer.
I think what sets Tobin apart for me is the sheer relentless brutality of him. A man who genuinely paid no attention whatever to anything but his own basest instinct. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, and could get away with it.
Former Detective Superintendent David Swindle from Strathclyde Police first came across Tobin after the body of Angelika Kluk was discovered at St Patrick's Church in Glasgow in 2006. The 23-year-old Polish student had been missing for 5 days.
Coming back to the church today brings it all back to me. The horrors of what must have happened here. Unbelievable. You could never imagine it. A place of worship desecrated by Peter Tobin doing what he did to Angelika Kluk.
But when they arrested Tobin, police were convinced this wasn't his first murder. David set up Operation Anagram, a task force charged with finding out more about the life and crimes of Peter Tobin.
When we looked at his life in Operation Anagram, we found that he frequented places like this: churches, religious establishment, homeless persons, hostels. How many people frequented the places that Tobin frequented? How many people did he meet that were vulnerable at that time, that had no relatives to report them missing? How many of these were missing and were never reported missing that Tobin has killed? We'll never know. Tobin knows the answer.
Throughout his life, Tobin, who was born and brought up a Catholic, had a persistent connection with the Catholic Church, and at various points during his periods on the run or disappearing or adopting false identities, took refuge in Catholic churches and Catholic communities. I think it was simply that was somewhere where he felt comfortable, where he knew how to conduct himself, where he could hide in plain sight. He could conceal his true nature behind the facade of a church handyman or a member of a Christian community. And that was a very safe way to conceal the reality of what he wanted.
To Tobin, nothing was sacred. He took advantage of the open nature of the Currans and the community of St Patrick's.
He was with us maybe about 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And then he started giving Father Jerry a hand in the church, and he's doing bits and pieces. People don't understand you can be with somebody a full day and they never spoke. You know what I mean? People find that hard to understand. There was nothing to sort of, it was a yes and no. That's what it was, a yes and a no.
Peter Tobin was an incredibly manipulative individual. He wasn't particularly emotionally complex himself, but he had a really good understanding of other people's emotions. He knew what other people needed to hear, and he used that to get what he wanted.
Kathy, however, had concern for the ominous stranger who joined their community.
I says to Dennis that there was something far wrong with them. I wasn't too sure what it was, but as far as I could understand, that the jigsaw with Pat McLaughlin was no fitting together. There was something not right there.
But Tobin's next step was more evil than any of them could have predicted. Angelika Kluk was a 23-year-old student from Skotzau near Krakow in Poland who was working as a cleaner in St. Patrick's Church. On the 24th of September 2006, she disappeared. Dennis broke the news to his wife.
He said, that girl, Angelika Kluk, we don't know where she is. And I went, what do you mean? He said, she's vanished. All her stuff's there, all her credit cards and everything are all up in their room, but she's vanished.
Police scoured the church and grounds for evidence and began interviewing members of the community. They discovered that the last person seen with Angelika was the church handyman, a man named Pat McLaughlin. Charity worker Dennis provided police with a photograph of McLaughlin.
At 6 o'clock it went in the evening news nationwide, and within minutes their phone line was jammed to say that's not Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin.
Police now had their main suspect. They quickly discovered that Tobin had a violent past, and the investigation escalated at rapid speed. David Swindle was the lead detective on the case.
I became involved in the investigation when it was established that Peter Tobin, a missing sex offender, had been with Angelika Kluk. And soon after my involvement, I arranged for the church to be searched again by specialist officers and specialist teams. There's a garage attached to the church, and that is where Peter Tobin was with Angelika Kluk, working on some woodwork. He called her his little apprentice. He actually was interviewed by a police officer when the missing person report was made, and he stayed there for another day, and when the heat was on, he left. When he realised it was being treated as a major investigation, he left. This is someone that was cool and calculated.
Police launched a nationwide search for Peter Tobin.
Mr. Tobin is considered a potential risk to members of the public. Any person who sees this man is advised not to approach him.
It was a name that sounded all too familiar to crime journalist Martin Brunt.
It was a shock to find what had happened, but what made it particularly interesting for crime reporters who were covering the case was that police were appealing for a man called Peter Tobin, and it rang bells. It took me and others back to the days of 1993. They didn't realise that he was, in reality, Peter Tobin with a dreadful history of sex crimes. He was a man hiding in that community under a false name, had duped the church authorities to employ him as a handyman, and of course they were completely innocent of his background.
As the search for Angelika intensified, it became more and more likely she wouldn't be found alive.
We had another search of the church, a really thorough search, because by this time the parameters had changed. There was concern for her safety.
5 days after her disappearance, on the 29th of September 2006, police discovered the body of Angelika Kluk under the floorboards of St. Patrick's Church. She'd suffered severe head injuries and multiple stab wounds after being attacked in the adjoining garage.
It was in there just after the priest, Father Jerry, left on that Sunday. Within minutes of it, someone across the road had heard a scream. He hit her over the head with a table leg. There was splinters in her head, rendered her unconscious or semi-conscious, bound her hands with cable ties, further assaulted her, dragged her in a polythene sheet into the church here and across the church, and put her body under the floor like a bag of rubbish. She was put under there. He stabbed her, whether that happened underneath there or whether it happened outside, and he raped her. He left her dead.
The British public was shocked to learn the truth of where Angelika's body had been hidden since her violent death.
This should have been a day of worship here at St Patrick's Church, but instead the building remains a crime scene, sealed off and guarded by police. And today brought the news that the people who laid those floral tributes were expecting but dreading that the body found hidden underneath the floorboards here was indeed that of the missing Polish student.
I think the discovery of Angelika's body was awful enough that a young woman had died in those circumstances. The fact that she was buried under a church added some sense of horror and drama to the way people reacted to it. The fact that a suspect was somebody who had been working at the church, somebody who seemingly had volunteered to be a handyman at the church, didn't really make sense.
DNA evidence on Angelika's body was confirmed as belonging to Peter Tobin, and his fingerprints were found on the tarpaulin he used to wrap her in.
In forensic pathology, we have what's called Locard's exchange principle. That says that when you interact with another person, you leave something of yourself on them, and you take something of them away with you. Anyone who murders another person, who physically interacts with them, they will leave trace evidence. They will leave DNA, potentially fibres, hairs, all sorts of things.
But Peter Tobin continued to elude the authorities. Despite a nationwide search, he disappeared into thin air.
So things were moving very fast. We have the human remains of a young woman who's been ferociously attacked. Horrible, horrible scene underneath the floorboards. Forensic examination is ongoing. We knew by this time that Peter Tobin had a history of violence, sexual crimes. He had been in prison. He was a dangerous person. Where was he?
David and his team wouldn't have to wait long for an answer. In early October, just over a week since Angelika's murder, they received a crucial breakthrough. Tobin had been spotted, this time using another alias, James Kelly, over 400 miles away.
We got a phone call from the police in London that he had checked into a hospital in a false name. Someone had recognised him. A Metropolitan police officer went in there and confirmed his identity. And I arranged for a team of uniform officers to bring him back to Scotland.
Rodney Alcala was born in San Antonio, Texas, on the 23rd of August, 1943.
He was, on the surface, a perfectly normal boy. Didn't kill small animals or do any of those other horrible things that serial killers tend to go on to do. But in 1951, when he was 8, his grandmother, who was ill, decided that she wanted to go back to die in Mexico. And so the whole family left Texas and went to Mexico.
But while living south of the US border, Alcala's father left the family home to start a new life.
The father abandons the family at that point in time and then goes back to living in the US. And I think that's quite a significant thing. I think that Alcala's relationship with his father was quite an important one to him. And I think that's something that stayed with Alcala throughout his life, and I think it does feed into his offending behaviour.
Aged 12, Alcala's mother moved him and his 3 siblings to Los Angeles to start a new life back in the US.
He's popular, he's on the yearbook committee, he plays the piano, he runs for the school, he has girlfriends, he's on the surface an all-American or all-Mexican-American boy.
After graduating from high school, Alcala joined the army. But his time was cut short after a death in the family had a devastating effect on him.
Whilst he's in the army, he has a nervous breakdown, and this is after his father has died. And he's given a medical discharge from the army because he has this nervous breakdown. And then he kind of goes off the radar for a while. So I think this is the period in which he starts perhaps fantasizing. His offending starts to take shape in his mind, if not in reality.
And in September 1968, Alcala committed a horrific crime. he lured an 8-year-old girl into his Hollywood home.
This is the worst nightmare for any parent. Rodney Alcala and people like him are the reason why you can't send your kids walking to school alone. He kidnaps her, he rapes her. A good Samaritan sees her get into his car, and it doesn't look right. And he follows the car to the house, and it doesn't look right. Now, this is 1968, so it's long before cell phones. He finds a payphone, calls it in, the police get there, knock on the door. Rodney shows up naked and says, "Hey, I'll be right with you."
But 25-year-old Alcala wasn't planning on getting caught red-handed.
He runs out the back naked, okay? And the police officer, who's by himself, looks down, and it's one of those situations where it's save this bleeding little girl on the floor who's unconscious and very close to death. She was in a coma for 33 days after this happened. So it's save the little girl or catch the bad guy running out of the back. And he did the right thing. He saved the little girl. But that meant Alcala got away.
It was a horrifically depraved and violent attack on a child that seemingly came out of nowhere.
Where was the motive for that? There was no sexual abuse that we know of in his childhood. There was no antipathy to women. It was an unexpected bolt from the blue.
Alcala decided to run far away from his crimes, 3,000 miles across the US. The description of the potential kidnapper given to a police sketch artist by Robin's friend looked remarkably similar to a known child molester.
This was a big deal media-wise because we had a missing 12-year-old girl, and Alcala's parole officer saw the composite on TV, and he called detectives and said, "You guys need to check out Rodney Alcala. It looks like him. It sounds like him. You got to look at Rodney Alcala." And like 15 minutes after they received that phone call, one of the cops is home, turns on the TV, and sees Alcala on the dating game.
Bachelor number one is a successful photographer. Please welcome Rodney Alcala. Rod, welcome.
And the host introduced the bachelors, and bachelor number one was Rodney Alcala. The detective frantically tried to call the police department and let other detectives know that he was on television so that they could turn it on and see him.
Alcala's appearance on the program, where women pick eligible bachelors without seeing their faces, was recorded 10 months earlier in September 1978. On the show that day with Alcala was actor Jed Mills.
The vibes I got from him while we were doing the show and backstage and even during the actual filming were not good vibes. There was something wrong with this guy.
Jed had met Alcala backstage before the recording.
Didn't talk much. We were guys, and he was this rather good-looking, creepy-looking guy, though. He had the weirdest fit football haircut. Everything was like perfect. The other guy and I were getting along very nicely, and we were talking about this and that, and every now and then this creepy guy would say something, like he had an attitude, because he knew better than everybody else.
When the cameras began rolling, Alcala turned on the charm.
I'm called the Banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
On the dating game show, the woman questioner asks each of the eligible bachelors, I'm going to eat you. What food are you? So Alcala, when he gave his answer, says, "Well, I'm a banana. Unpeel me."
And I said, "Oh my God, this guy's such a creep."
But it was enough to win him the date.
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take one.
Number one, bachelor number one, all right.
On the outside, Alcala appeared to be a charming, good-looking man. But deep inside, he was hiding a dark history. What the viewing public didn't know was that contestant number one was a serial killer. By the time he appeared on the show in September 1978, Alcala had already killed 5 women. Over 35 years on, Jed Mills still feels anger towards his fellow contestant.
Thinking back on it, it was very spooky, that I was in a room with this guy. Had I known, I'd have killed him right there. my bare hands, that he was killing women. Horrible, just horrible.
Prior to his national TV appearance, Alcala had already murdered 23-year-old Cornelia Criley in June 1971 in New York. And then in July 1977, he killed another young woman in the city, 23-year-old Ellen Hover. Over the following 12 months, he struck again, this time in Southern California. Among his innocent victims, 18-year-old Jill Barkham, 27-year-old Georgia Wickstead, and 32-year-old Charlotte Lamb. All were murdered by the 34-year-old who was now hiding in plain sight.
Most serial killers, or killers in general, want to avoid detection, want to avoid publicity, want to avoid the spotlight, and this guy was actually seeking it out, which is, an indication of his personality.
He really does love being in the limelight, so I think he would have really enjoyed appearing on that dating show in the 1970s.
Alcala pled guilty to both New York murders, taking his total number of victims to 7. In 2010, over 100 pictures found in Alcala's Seattle storage unit were released into the public domain by detectives in a bid to identify potential victims. As a result, Alcala has since been charged with killing a 28-year-old woman in Wyoming in 1977. Many of the photographs found in the locker were too graphic to be released, meaning many of the women remain unaccounted for.
Alcala may be the most dangerous of all of the killers that have ever been caught, because while he was only charged with a relatively small number of murders, the number of pictures he had means that he may have killed in excess of 100 people.
Given the volume of the photographs, we always knew that we had other victims. We didn't know who they were.
Alcala was forced to pay for some of his crimes, but for the families of the deceased, the pain of losing a loved one is a punishment that lasts forever.
I don't think Robin's family is ever going to be at peace. They had their 12-year-old sister kidnapped and brutally murdered in the mountains of Los Angeles County. They live with that every day when they look at her photographs that they have on their shelves. It tormented them then, and when people bring it up today, it's further torment for them. So I don't think they'll ever be at peace. They'll certainly be elated the day he dies, but at peace, I think they're just dealing with it.
74-year-old Rodney Alcala remains on death row in Corcoran State Prison in California. He has never admitted to any other murders.
Well, if I was to describe Alcala with 3 words, it would be me, me, me. This man is an absolute narcissist, and he doesn't care about the rights or the feelings of other people, and all of his behaviour revolves around him. So he's somebody who was only going to ever pursue his own desires, and unfortunately, this ended up in a lot of people losing their lives.
For these psychopaths, their main thing, they want to control things. They want to be in control, they want the attention on them. That's kind of what drives them. He went up, he made his whole pitch, and they soundly rejected him. They rejected his defense. They rejected everything that he stood for, and found that he deserved to die for what he did.
My feelings towards the monster, it's rage, it's anger, and I really hope that he's suffering. He's in poor physical health. He's being fed through a feeding tube. It's reported that he has Alzheimer's. I hope all of this is true, and that one day I get that phone call that he is gone, and nobody will ever have to hear his name again.
Rodney Alcala killed at least 6 women and a 12-year-old girl. He was a terrifying predator hiding behind a charming persona, and attacked his victims for nothing other than his own selfish pleasures. To this day, we still do not know why he did it. When he finally dies, Alcala will be remembered as one of the most dangerous men in America and one of the world's most evil killers.
Killing gave him pleasure.
One of the characteristics of Karol Kot was that after he would kill, he took great pleasure in licking the knife and tasting the blood. This aspect of the vampirism is something that has made his crimes sufficiently unique.
This killer's story begins a little over 70 years ago. Karol Kot was born in Krakow in southern Poland on December the 18th, 1946, to a middle-class family. On the surface, their home life seemed happy and healthy.
His father worked as an engineer, his mother was a stay-at-home mum, and they were quite a respectable family.
It was like a good, loving family. His mother didn't work, especially for him, so he didn't have to go to preschool. And he was raised in a Jewish quarter of Krakow.
But when Karol Kot was 8 years old, his sister was born.
I think that really did unsettle him quite a lot because he's been used to being the centre of attention for 8 years. He feels that she's the favoured one. And whether or not that's true, often when we look at dynamics in families, it's not what parents are doing or not doing, it's how children are perceiving that. So I think he felt pushed out, I think he felt slighted right from the beginning.
Later, Karol Kot said that his parents loved her more than him. He said that's why he abused her. He tried to introduce military order at home.
I think Kot's relationship with his sister is a warning sign. And this was the beginning, I think, of a process for Kot, a process of expressing himself in a dysfunctional way when things weren't going as he wanted them to go. And it's one that escalates slowly over time.
Another sign that all was not well with the boy was his cruelty to animals.
They had 2 cats in the house, and he was like treating cats badly. He was throwing them at the walls, things like that.
Often when we look back at the childhoods of serial killers, we see some form of harm, some form of abuse towards animals. And this is something that individuals do to maintain some control, because they have feelings of trauma, of anxiety, of basically feeling slighted, of feeling left out.
On family holidays to the village of Pachim, 30 miles south of Krakow, Kot developed an unnatural passion.
He developed a fascination with slaughterhouses. On holiday, he would go with his parents and ask to go to the slaughterhouse. Now, this is quite unusual in a young man of 10, 11, 12.
That's when he understood that he loves blood. He's fascinating with blood. He was talking about it like he noticed that blood is still warm. It was alive just a moment ago, and that it was something very special for him.
One of the most extraordinary incidents when he was in the slaughterhouse was that the slaughtermen drained blood into a cup and passed it to him for him to drink. They thought this boy would simply freak out. He did exactly the opposite. He drank the blood, which in turn freaked them out.
Here's a child who goes on family holidays to the countryside, and what do normal children do? What are they interested in? They're interested in playing, running through the woods, maybe picking flowers, right? Swimming if it's possible. What does Karol Kot want to do? He wants to slice up an animal, and he wants to drink the animal's blood, and he wants to do it in front of people, and he wants them to be entertained by it or amazed by it. This is extraordinarily rare behavior.
At the same time, young Karol Kot developed a disturbing fetish.
He said that knife was like his biggest love he can think of. He was admiring knives. He actually can speak in surprisingly sophisticated language about knives.
Kot's rare obsession would soon prove deadly.
This is a weapon. This is something that he can use to threaten other people. And carrying a knife makes him feel important. It makes him feel powerful.
Later he started to thinking, how does it feel to put knife into a human body? But he didn't have the courage. So he started to hurting small animals at first. And he noticed that blood affects him. It makes him excited.
While at school, Kot joined a target shooting club where he met a girl, Danusha, that he soon became obsessed with. She was 6 years older than Karol.
They became like friends, but from his side, I think this relationship looked a bit different. I think she treated him as a friend and he was in love.
It wouldn't surprise me if this relationship wasn't one of equals, because I think here we've got a young lad who has difficulty relating to other people. He doesn't have those social skills.
In a twisted bid to impress Danusha, Kot revealed to her some of his sadistic fantasies and cruel acts he had committed.
I suspect she finds him cute. She's sure the stories are untrue or made up, but she's just not excited by them. And in some ways, that's exactly what Kot needs. He needs somebody who can hear his craziness, who he can brag to, who he can storytell to, who he can relive with, and not have them screaming bloody murder.
On a shooting club outing, the young Kot could not contain his violent urges.
After having told her that he's this person, he attempts to prove it to her by attacking her and even starting to strangle her.
He attacked her. He pulled out a piece of broken glass from his pocket. He told her he wanted to cut her wrists and throw her into the river so it would look like a suicide. Start a fire. It did not. He tried to set an attic on fire. He said there was smoke and fire, but no inferno.
Fortunately, no one was killed in any of the 4 fires that he set.
And again, he doesn't even know how to set a fire. He can't get a whole structure to burn down to save his life. He's just trying to find a way to get death to happen, doing as little as possible, and he can't seem to figure it out.
By February of 1966, 17 months after his first murder, Kot could no longer contain the urge to kill again.
I think he definitely would have been fantasizing during that period about those attacks he carried out before. So he carried out some very violent attacks that had a real impact on the local community. He created fear, and he was reveling in that. He was enjoying that. And when he came to kill again, it was going to be something horrendous.
But this time he changes direction. He doesn't target elderly women, he targets children. He goes to a local mound which attracts tobogganists, particularly children.
On Sunday, February the 13th, 1966, Karol Kot was looking for an easy target when he spotted 11-year-old Leszek.
He was just walking alone because he was a bit late to that competition. And Karol just was walking around looking for a victim.
For Leszek, the speed of the attack would likely have been stunning.
And this attack is really ferocious. So he turns the boy towards him. He stabs him 11 times. Now this is a real ramping up of his offending. So he's not just killing this individual, he's using much more violence than he needs to get that job done. So this is about more than that. This is about completely obliterating someone. This is about saying, well, I can do to you whatever I want to do to you. It's about status, it's about power, and it's about entitlement.
We must be grateful to some extent that stab wounds are not usually tremendously painful. They can often feel more like a punch, but it must have been utterly confusing and bewildering that somebody has suddenly started to assault you and then very quickly, within probably seconds in this case, you will lose consciousness and die. You've gone from being a normal child, doing normal childhood things, to being a body.
The autopsy later revealed that Kot had punctured every major organ in the young boy's body.
The stabs were deep. The strikes damaged the aorta, the heart, the lungs and the liver. The boy had no chance of surviving the attack.
As Lesek lay bleeding to death, Kot walked away.
He just left him like this and walked away. What also surprised me was that he said that he went straight to the patisserie, bought some cakes and took them home.
The attack on the 11-year-old boy was a clear sign that Kot's ferocity had escalated.
This is Kot in his new form. This is the fully fledged butterfly. He's absolutely at one and determined to destroy his victim. It isn't very long before he chooses another.
Krakow, southern Poland. By the end of February 1966, Karol Kot, now aged 19, had viciously attacked 4 people with a knife, killing 2, 86-year-old Maria and an 11-year-old boy, Lesek. But Karol Kot's lust for blood was far from satiated. On April 14th, 1966, 2 months after he last killed, Kot struck again.
His next attack is on a 7-year-old.